Hey guys, thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are going to be talking about Bitcoin, but we're also going to be talking about how it behaves with respect to the S&P 500. Now, if you're not familiar with the S&P 500, it's essentially it tracks the performance of like the 500 largest companies in the United States. It's one of the most, I would say, commonly used equity indexes. To determine, how the U.S., how the stocks are doing in general. So I'm sure many of you guys already know this, but just in case you're only buried into cryptocurrency, the S&P is used by a lot of people. I mean, way more people that are than in crypto. So, one of the things that comes up, and I would actually ask if you guys would subscribe to the channel if you guys like this content and like the video and turn your notifications on. I'm actually making a couple videos. I just made a video tonight, and I'll probably post this one tomorrow, just so I keep them somewhat spread out. But yeah, please subscribe to the channel. We're gonna basically look at the idea that people have talked about is what happens, what would happen if we experienced a recession. So if you guys remember, Bitcoin was essentially born out of the recession in 2008. So it really has not experienced a recession in the United States, or like say a global or worldwide recession, since its inception. So there's a lot of speculation as to how it would behave. Would people be moving money into Bitcoin to escape what's happening, around the world? Like, would it be seen as a store of value? Or alternatively, would people think of it as a lot of times during recessions, people liquidate their high-risk assets because it's a recession, and it's just kind of something that a lot of people do. So, there's kind of two schools of thought. Is Bitcoin going to be that ultimate store of value that investors are going to flock to avoid the recession or what it brings? Or is it, or people are going to, sell Bitcoin because of how volatile and risky it is? Well, let's just look. We can't get any definitive answers about what would happen with Bitcoin until a recession actually occurs, and then we can observe what Bitcoin does to get an idea. But let's just briefly look at the history of Bitcoin and the S&P 500. So on the left here, we have the Bitcoin price on a logarithmic scale, and then so that corresponds to the blue line. And then over here we have the S&P 500 in orange, and note that it is not a log scale, it is a linear scale. And let's just look at what happens and how these markets are correlated, if they are at all. So first, let's just highlight bear markets that Bitcoin has, where there's an extended period of time where the market is down. And what was the S&P doing during that time? Well, here you can see the S&P actually did see a pretty decent drop, but it saw this drop, but Bitcoin was already headed down. It's not like, Bitcoin more or less just continued what it had already started doing. It's not like this drop here triggered the beginning of a long bear market for Bitcoin. If we go over here, you can see that the S&P was actually doing quite well between 2014 and 2015, and this was when Bitcoin was doing quite poorly. So in terms of that, you can see it's not really correlated at all with if the S&P is doing well, it does not mean Bitcoin's doing well. Now, that does not mean, the counter argument is not necessarily true. Just because the S&P is doing bad does not mean Bitcoin has to do bad or perform poorly. But again, these are not recessions. These are just corrections or small corrections in the S&P. And then here you can see Bitcoin saw this massive drop that we've recently experienced, and here you can see this is what the S&P was doing. It was actually going up quite a bit, and then it dropped a ton. But when it dropped over here, Bitcoin had already dropped. It's not like Bitcoin dropped in lieu of this. Bitcoin was actually over in this area and more or less stayed stable when the S&P saw this enormous drop. So if we go to the next slide, let's just look at big corrections in the S&P and like to see what Bitcoin was doing. So here we saw a big correction down from this point to here. Bitcoin also went down, but Bitcoin was already going down. Over here, we see a pretty big drop, and then actually Bitcoin was pretty stable and started going up. Here, we saw a pretty big drop. Bitcoin was pretty stable. Here, we saw a massive drop. Bitcoin actually went up and then came back down. I mean, you can see how big this drop is from here to here. I mean, we dropped, from several $100s on the S&P. And then here you can see this, pretty big drop over here that, happened, at the end of 2018 that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And during that time, Bitcoin was more or less just humdrum, not really doing a whole lot. So, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that during a recession, Bitcoin is going to perform one way or another, but at least we can look to see, how correlated are they when they're not in a recession? And it doesn't really seem like they're correlated that much. I mean, if you were to calculate the correlation coefficient on this, I think it was around 0.8, which is just statistically significant, but the only reason it's that high is just because there's 10 years of data, and for the most part, both assets have just been increasing. So, I wouldn't put too much credence into that correlation. You can see that in any short-term moves that are not really indicative of recessions, Bitcoin is pretty, it's more apathetic as to what the S&P is doing in terms of what Bitcoin is doing. I mean, it more or less seems like Bitcoin's doing its own thing. It doesn't really care what the S&P is doing. So, we can at least say that in the short term, if the S&P were to say drop 100 points, or if it were to whatever it might do in the short term, it's not necessarily going to affect Bitcoin's price. At least it doesn't seem like it has historically affected it. But obviously there's not really evidence one way or another to say that if we were to undergo, say, like a worldwide recession, it remains unknown as to what Bitcoin would do. And I know there's two schools of thought. I mean, if you guys want to, let me know what you guys think in the comments, that'd be great, and I'll read through them and respond accordingly. But yeah, what do you guys think? Just let me know in the comments. Do you think if the S&P, if the worldwide economy were to experience a recession, would Bitcoin be considered a store of value, or would it be considered one of those high-risk assets that need to get liquidated? I'd like to hear what you guys think on this, because so far Bitcoin has not had to experience this, and at some point in the future, I'm sure. I mean, it will experience a recession. It's just a matter of time. It might be next year. It might be 5 years from now. It might be 10 years from now. We don't really know. And just for completeness, let's just plot the ratio. So this is Bitcoin divided by the S&P 500 ratio. And you can see that it basically just looks like the normal Bitcoin price curve. Obviously, the axes are different, the values are different, but it more or less just looks like the Bitcoin price, because what Bitcoin was doing with respect to the S&P, it basically made what the S&P doing completely negligible, and really have no impact on what that ratio was, because the S&P was more or less increasing rather steadily throughout this entire time frame. I know this is a linear scale again, and this is a logarithmic scale. There's a big difference between the two. So I think that covers this video. I wanted to keep it short and sweet. Remember to subscribe and like the video if you guys like the content, and I will see you next time. Bye.